tax competition is both a termite, but also it has opened the gate for many other termites to enter in the tax system. There was a time in my life when I was younger when I thought that economics or tax economics, could be neutral in the sense that could ignore ideology and could be based on results, on theory which were shared. Now I no longer believe in that. I see too much ideology. If I know the views, the political bias of an expert, I always know what he will write. And that's sad, because that's a sad realization. Means that economics has ceased to become scientific, as we believe that it could be at one point. There's a debate among economists. Some economists have argued that tax competition is good because it keeps government from increasing taxes too much. Well, that's one way of looking at things. But if one believes that the government is a democratic government and its government is reflecting what the majority of people want, then it has become more difficult for government to do that. That in a way the tax competition has put some government in a straitjacket where they are forced to have a kind of tax system they may not really like to have. If you look historically, there was a time when many countries, in the 60s, many countries had marginal tax rate on the super rich that were 90%. There was a famous Beatles song that was called The Tax Man, which said, "I'll tell you how it will be, 1 for you, 19 for me," because in the UK at that time, the marginal tax rate, the highest rate, was close to 95%. So over time, this tax rate came dramatically down, and they were pushed dramatically down by the tax reform in the US in 1986, which lowered the highest rate from about 70% or so, which had been in earlier years, to about 28%. And many other countries were forced to do the same. If you look at the marginal tax rate over the years after 1986, they all came down dramatically. Today, you no longer have tax rates which are very high. The same thing has happened to corporation. Corporation used to have rates which were 50-60%. Now you have rates normally of 20-25, maximum 30%. So clearly there has been a dramatic lowering of the rates, and this has benefited certain activity, a certain class of people over other people. So there has been, in a way, a movement toward the bottom. It affects tax systems in two ways. One, that for some countries it makes it more and more difficult to maintain the level of taxation that they may decide they may want to have. In fact, the level of taxation has really not gone up after the 90s. If you take an average level of taxation, it has even come down. And in the 90s, it already has slowed down the growth of the level of taxation. So this is the first way in which the tax competition affects tax system. The other way is by distorting tax systems, distorting them away from what maybe government might want to have or some country might want to have. It makes easier for government to have some kind of taxes rather than other kind of taxes, even when this is not their preference. Tax competition has made possible for some small countries, especially the smallest country, to take advantage of of the world tax base. And it has made more difficult for large countries to maintain the level of taxation that they want and the kind of taxation that they want. So it has made much more difficult to maintain certain tax law. For example, taxation of very high income people has become much more difficult because these people have become very mobile because of tax competition. Taxation of enterprises has also become more difficult because enterprise can move from high tax country to low tax countries. So there are many ways in which tax competition has affected tax systems, and not always in the desirable way. Whether countries can do something about or not, well, it has become progressively more difficult for them to do something about it. But large countries still have the power to introduce laws which will help them to fight this process. You know, the U.S. is a very strong country and clearly can do that. You know, but there's a limit to what countries individually can do, and this brings us to another part of the discussion, whether countries should act globally. You know, and it would be nice if all countries could get together and could agree on rules which were beneficial to all and where nobody could take advantage of others. Whether the world needs some sort of a world authority, world tax organization, as I've called it in some of my writing. You know, the first time I suggest the idea was in 1995 when I wrote a book for Brookings, and I suggest the idea, and then I've written several other papers on the issue. The idea attracted some attention, but no real action. You know, so far I've not seen much action in that direction. I see clearly a need for this kind of institution that would promote a good principle, would hire the best tax expert in the world, would suggest ways of dealing with problems, would shame countries which are not following the right rules, would have a kind of surveillance over the tax system of countries. Now there is no institution that does this, you know. That's again, the OECD tries to do it, but in a very limited fashion. The OECD has been trying to promote some rules for countries, but without much success, and maybe there's an explanation for that, because the OECD is an institution that represents mostly richer countries. It's not really a world institution. The idea of having a broad agreement among countries, it's an idea which doesn't have much realism. Now each country goes on its own. You know, one country says "my country first," and other countries try to follow that. So that the necessity of a World Tax Organization, for me, is obvious. Just like we have a World Trade Organization, you know. I don't see the logic for having a World Trade Organization and not a World Tax Organization. So on the necessity. On the feasibility is a different story, because as I said, you know, the world has moved a long way from what it was in the 50s, when many major thinkers, from Einstein to Churchill to Gandhi, they thought that some sort of world authority, world governance was possible and was desirable. But now many countries don't think that way. Nationalism is prevalent in many countries, and as long as this thinking prevails, I don't see much chance that a World Tax Organization will come into existence. But again, I want to distinguish this from the necessity. I see the necessity, I see less likely the feasibility. obviously different countries, they have different needs for tax revenue because they want different welfare systems. You know, if you are a Scandinavian country, you want a very well developed welfare system. If you are an American, US, you want a much less spending. So you don't want to have the same taxes for everybody. But certain activities do require a minimum tax. For example, global corporate income tax. You know, global corporation should definitely be exposed to the same minimum tax. Otherwise, it becomes convenient for a corporation to set residence in a very low tax country and report the profits to that country and pay very little taxes. So the answer is that yes, for particular taxes, there should be a minimum minimum tax, you know, across countries. And again, corporate income tax would be one of them. Maybe even the highest marginal tax rate on billionaires would be another one. So you don't have the situation reported by Buffett that his driver pays more taxes than he does. You know, this kind of situation should not exist. Well, if you look at almost all statistics, there is really very little controversy on this. If you look at the share of total income going to the top 1%, this has increased dramatically in most countries. In the US, probably more than in other countries. It has increased from about 10% to 25%. If you look at the share of wealth going to the top, to the very rich, this has gone up dramatically. You know, if you look at the marginal tax rate on the super rich, these have come down dramatically. At the same time, we know that the saving rate of the rich have gone up sharply because they have so much money, they don't know what to do with it. At the same time, the people who are not in the top 1%, they are experiencing a very large increase in debt, in private debt, and countries are experiencing a lot of public debt. So that you know, inevitably will need a revenue in the future to pay pension for pension systems, to pay for infrastructure and so forth. And this money cannot come from the bottom 50% or the bottom 90%. And much of this money will have to come from those who have received the largest share of total income and wealth. So the answer to your question is definitely, without, you know, I don't think we should go back to the 50 and 60 where the marginal tax rate were in the 90s, but a higher share of the total burden coming from the top 1%, I don't think will do any disservice to the world, and on the other hand, will help a lot. I've become convinced in recent years that global warming is the mother of all negative externalities. You know, really, it's an externality that if it becomes concrete 10, 20, 30 years from now, you know, the world in which we live in will be a different world and not a very pleasant world. You know, many of the major cities will be underwater, you know, we'll have big storms and so forth. So that in principle, you know, if we can do something about the weather by reducing consumption of energy and so forth, we should do something about it because it's very, very important. At the same time, we get back to the discussion earlier that if a country does too much of it, but other countries don't, and we still have a globalization, the country that does too much of it doesn't get many benefits and get a lot of the cost. So again, it's something that requires a global coordination. But the answer to your question, yes, we should worry about green taxes and so forth. One additional point that I want to to add, I wrote a short article recently for a publication, which is that unfortunately democracy worry about the very short run. You know, if you are running the elections, you don't want to increase taxes on energy or whatever. You worry about the election 2-3 years from now. They don't worry about the long run. So that there is a tendency to give more importance to the short run than to the long run. And green taxes really have to do with the long run. So that once again, some sort of global coordination or cooperation would be helpful and would be necessary. There are two schools of thoughts on this. One school of thought, which seems to be the prevalent one, is that you know, in recent years the world has been worried more about deflation than about inflation, and they think that this will continue because demand will go down because of unemployment and so forth. So the concern for some people still remains deflation. I'm not convinced of that, because what is happening is that you know, countries, in order to fight the virus, they're pumping a lot of money into the market. You know, fiscal deficits are going down dramatically in almost all countries. You know, public debt, by the time we come out of the crisis, will be very much higher than it is today. And so the question is, what will happen to this very large expansion of public debt and fiscal deficit? What impact they will have on prices? And here is maybe I'll be a little bit more technical, but I'll try to be clear. You know, the problem will be one of measuring inflation. You know, you measure inflation at a moment of time, looking at what happened to many prices, thousands of prices, and assigning a weight to each one of those goods and services that is contributing to inflation or deflation, whatever it is. So the index depends on two factors: the moment of prices and the weight that each goods and service has in the distribution of income of individual and enterprise and so forth. Well, in the next few months or in the next year or so, we will have a dramatic change in the composition of the output. Some expenditure will simply disappear or will go down dramatically. Airlines, hotels, cruises, maybe universities expenses, haircuts. You know, I've not been at my barber for 4 months now, and so forth. So the demand for certain goods will go down dramatically. At the same time, the demand for other goods, groceries, and so forth, will go up dramatically. So it's possible to have a situation that if you measure inflation using old weights, then we will not have much of an inflation. If you measure inflation measuring new weights, then possibly the prices will go up, because you know, if you go to the grocery, you already see some prices have gone up dramatically, and so this is the question. So to summarize, to conclude, my view is that inflation is more likely than deflation after the crisis. Now the other question, which is, will this lead to hyperinflation? That possibly is less likely, at least not in the US or Canada or countries like this. You could have that in Argentina, Venezuela, Turkey, and a few others. And since if we don't have hyperinflation, then the Tanzi effect becomes not very important. You will have more the effect that we have in the 70s, when the income of people were pushed up, and because of the fact that they were pushed up, they were pushed into higher marginal tax rate, and the government ended up having more revenue than less revenue. So the answer that maybe the Tanzi effect, hopefully, is something of the past, even though personally I lose, you know, because my reputation depends in part on it. So that's the conclusion, and I hope I'm right. I'm right on both the fact that we will not have a hyperinflation, and I'm right on the fact that we will have a little bit of inflation and not deflation.